So my name is Tom Munson. I'm the archives manager here at the Sioux City Public Museum, and we're going to be looking at History at High Noon, Victorian houses in Sioux City. This was a talk that was, several years ago we gave out survey forms and had people request tentative topics for these talks, and I know Victorian architecture was one of those choices. So here we are a few years later, and we're actually giving that presentation. So if you've read any of the publicity about this, you know that Victorian architecture was one of the dominant forms of architecture in the United States after 1850, and especially after the Civil War. And particularly one type of Victorian architecture is Queen Anne. And Queen Anne Victorian architecture was incredibly popular here in Sioux City from 1880 to 1900. And this also for Sioux City, this was our big era of growth. From 1880 to 1890, Sioux City's population increased fivefold, from 7,500 to 40,000 people, and then Sioux City just kept on growing into the 1890s. So really, every year from 1888, 1889, 1890, 91, there were hundreds, if not thousands of homes constructed every year, many of them using Victorian, and more specifically Queen Anne Victorian-style architecture. So there we have that. So what exactly is Victorian architecture? Victorian architecture was named by New York City architect Norman Shaw. It's interesting that though the style was named for the long reign of England's Queen Victoria from 1837 to 1901, there's very little Victorian, or what we would consider Victorian architecture in England. It's largely an American style, and it was used, it derives from different medieval forms of European architecture, but really the Victorian architecture movement was isolated in the United States. So Queen Anne Victorian architecture was a break from earlier Romantic architecture. Victorian architecture was largely based on the evolution of the Industrial Revolution. So traditional wood post and beam framing was being replaced by stick framing. So that's what we consider today relatively conventional dimensional lumber framing. Stick framing allowed buildings to be not merely boxes, but instead have complex shapes. Things like towers and bay windows, which we are going to see a lot of those in this presentation. The Industrial Revolution made possible mass production of dimensional lumber, so like 2x4s and 2x6s. The Industrial Revolution also made the production of wire nails much easier, and mass production of architectural ornaments. So many of the architectural elements we're going to see were mass manufactured and just simply put together on site. Now there are 6 subtypes. I've already mentioned the dominant one I'm going to be talking about today is Queen Anne. But the earliest Victorian architecture that started around the 1850s was Second Empire. Stick came into being around 1880. So did Queen Anne, shingle style, Richardsonian Romanesque, and folk Victorian. Now, some of you may have already seen my Richardsonian Romanesque talk, so you have a little bit of an idea about what that is. So, saying that, let's get moving and take a look at some pictures and find out some fascinating information about houses. This is a John H. Charles house, built in 1872 at 721 Pierce Street. This is a Second Empire house. So there are 3 main features in the Second Empire style. Those would be, on the second floor above the main entrance, you can see these things that look like large blocks. These are implemented in brick, and those are called coins. That is one major element you'll see in Second Empire style houses. And then brackets under the eaves. They're heavily bracketed. But the main characteristic of a Second Empire style house is the Mansard Roof. And this form of architecture originated in France, and an architect involved was, his last name was Mansart. That was anglicized to Mansard, and that's basically this relatively steep and sometimes curved second or third story roof. Here we can see that same roof line here in this front-facing gable end. Now, there are not many Second Empire style houses in Sioux City, but I've chosen just a few to take a look at. This is the interior of John Charles's house, and that's John Charles's portrait above the fireplace. You can see the high ceilings, the coved plaster between the upper wall and the ceiling. And this is his library. John Hare Charles was one of the persons whose collection eventually formed the basis of the Sioux City Public Museum's collection. Here you can see John Charles's dining room. Another key characteristic of this style of architecture are the shallow arched door and window openings. This is another characteristic of this particular style. This is the John P. Allison house, built in 1879, located at 8th and Douglas Street. Again, we see the characteristics. No coins here, but we see dentil molding here at the top, brackets at the base of the 3rd floor, and that steep multi-pitched roof. And towers are also very common. 3- and 4-story towers are also common on this style of architecture. This is the Heinrich Adolphus Jant house, built in 1882 at 903 6th Street. I believe all the images we're seeing of Second Empire houses, these are all gone. This was built by retailer H.A. Jant. And again, we can see the 4-story tower and the mansard roof. William Livingston was another early Sioux City merchant. He built his house out of wood. Wood frame, stick frame was a little bit unusual for this style. This house was located at 718 Jackson Street and built in 1882. It was also featured on the cover on the dust jacket of the novel Sioux City by J. Hyatt Downing. So now, the bulk of this talk is going to be about these subdivisions of Victorian architecture, which are Queen Anne, stick, shingle, and Richardsonian Romanesque. As we go along, I will point out individual characteristics, so by the end, you're going to have a great idea of what this kind of architecture really is. This is the earliest house. I'm going to stay near downtown, and I'll be moving out farther away from downtown as we move throughout this talk. The D.T. Gilman house was built in 1882 at 815 Nebraska Street. This house was designed by the firm of James Corey and E.W. Loft. The cost of construction was $10,500. Now, the first parts of style I want to point out here, Victorian-style houses generally have an asymmetrical facade, meaning they're not the same from one side to the other. If you cut them in half, they're going to be different on either end. And very often, with Queen Anne-style architecture, you'll have a dominant front gable. This house, you can see on the left, there's a dominant front-facing gable. This house, by the way, is still standing. The L.S. Fawcett House was built in 1884 at 1015 9th Street. The cost of construction of this house was $4,000. Another characteristic of Victorian-style houses are steeply pitched roofs, and you can see it's greater than a 45-degree angle, making it a steep pitched roof. This house happens to be, even though it's painted white, was built out of brick. So this is a masonry house, and you can see in this inset on the right, you can see the wavy patterns on that gable end. That's just a patterned brick, which is typical in Victorian masonry houses. The Joseph Henry Swan House, also built in 1884, located at 1005 Jennings Street, built at a cost of $9,000. The key characteristic I want to point out here is an irregularly shaped roof. Remember, Victorian-style architecture were no longer squares, so we have parts of the building jutting out. Therefore, we'll have an irregularly shaped roof because of things like wings and bays and towers. We're just going to end up with an irregularly shaped roof. This is the Frederick Clark Hills House, built in 1885 at 812 Douglas Street. Towers are one of the dominant features of Queen Anne Victorian-style architecture, as well as turrets. Now, what's the difference between a tower and a turret? Well, this house features a tower. Towers rise from the ground up, whereas a turret is like a tower, but instead of extending all the way to the base of the house, it is cantilevered out of the corner or a side of a house. This particular house also features on the gable end here, half timbering. So this is reminiscent of medieval and early Renaissance England Tudor-style houses. So you have this crosshatch wood pattern on that gable end, and we'll see a lot more of that as we go throughout this program. The George D. Perkins house. Perkins was the longtime editor of the Sioux City Journal. This is his house, built in 1885 at 820 Jackson Street. So again, we see a tower. This is a square tower, which happens to be the least common type of tower on a Victorian-style house. Now, and also looking at this style a little bit more, masonry is less common than stick framing, and really the only masonry or brick examples we'll see of Queen Anne Victorian-style architecture are the early examples and some of the larger examples. Again, we're in 1885, so this is still relatively early. This house cost $15,000 to make, to build. I should just make a little note. The typical 3-bedroom house, basically 5-room house at this time, was costing around $1,500 to $2,000 to build. Thomas J. Stone, early Sioux City banker, had this house built in 1885 at 624 Jones Street. This house was designed by George Baldwin and cost $19,500. This structure actually has 2 octagonal towers, one you can see on the left and on the right. In masonry examples, this is again a patterned masonry house. So in this little inset you can see here on the right, you can see the date, the year of the house. That is implemented in decorative brick. There's a little band of circles above that. That is implemented in terracotta. And on the roof we can see patterned shingles. This was relatively common in Queen Anne Victorian style houses. The Charles M. Swan House was built in 1886, located at 815 Jennings Street. This house was built by Nathaniel G. Hedges. The cost of construction was $6,500. Now this is a subset of Victorian architecture. This is called the stick substyle, and it is defined by decorative trusses. So you can see here on the right, I've kind of zoomed in on that main gable, and the wood cross-hatching and the area surrounding these windows is all half-timbered. Again, this is reminiscent of medieval English architecture. The Andrew T. Walls House, built in 1887 at 813 Douglas Street. Another characteristic of Victorian-style houses are full or wraparound porches. You can see here the 2 main facades are covered by a front porch. This house also, if you look to the roof line, you can see the eyebrow window located right there in the center of the house. We'll see more of those pop up in a little bit. The Edward P. Stone House was built in 1887. It was at 1111 Jones Street. Cost of construction was $6,000. Another characteristic of Victorian architecture is spindle work, also known as gingerbread, also known as East Lake design. And East Lake design was named for English furniture designer Charles Eastlake. And you can see this zoomed in portion with the turn spindles at the top of the front porch and the porch column there. We'll see a lot more of that too as we go along through this program. The John M. Knott House. This house is still standing. It was built in 1887 and is located at 914 Jackson Street. The house was built or designed by architect J.W. Martin, and the cost of construction was $10,000. Feature I wanted to point out in this photograph was a finial. The finial is that pointy thing at the top of the tower. And again, we can also see patterned shingles. There are scalloped shaped shingles on the roof of this tower. The Craig L. Wright House, built in 1887 at 817 8th Street. This house was designed by prolific Sioux City architect Charles Porter Brown, built for $12,000. We do have photos of this house, but none of those photos show it as well as this drawing does. Here we can see a turret. So here on the corner in the center of the image, you can see that kind of tower thing, but it doesn't extend all the way to the ground. It pops out of the corner of that building. That is a turret. And again, anything with Queen Anne Victorian style architecture, any architectural element to break up flat planes. So it may be different patterned shingles. It may be a bay window. It may be a balcony. Anything to break up flat surfaces. That's what the Queen Anne Victorians liked. This is the Wilbur P. Manley House. Built in 1888 at 1101 Jones Street. This house was also designed by Charles Porter Brown and built at a cost of $8,000. The W.F. Thomas house is a little bit more simple. It was built in 1890, and I believe this house is still standing at 1214 Jones Street. The cost of construction of this house was $4,500. You can start to see some of these elements repeating: the irregularly shaped roof, dominant gables, the asymmetry. The C.W. Jackson house, built in 1892, was at 916 Jennings Street. The cost of construction was $8,500. What I want to look at in this image is the Palladian Window. So on the third floor gable, you can see in this image here on the right, you have a large arched window flanked by two smaller windows. That is a Palladian window. We'll also see more of these pop up through the talk. Moving out of the downtown area to the near North Side and Rose Hill neighborhoods. This is the Albert Nash house, built in 1885. It was located at 1223 Grandview. I know it's kind of a ratty looking picture, but it shows some neat things. The cost of construction of this house is $3,200, but this again is another stick style Victorian house. You can see on the left, that protruding front gable, you can see the half timbering, the cross beams and the vertical beams. And in this stick style, it's very common to see groups of 3 windows. And we can see those groupings of 3 windows repeat 3 times in this house, both on that large gable end and on the small jut out above the front porch. The James A. Foy House, built in 1886 at 415 Nebraska Street. This house is a little interesting because one of our key characteristics of a Victorian-style house is a steeply pitched roof. This house has a relatively shallow pitched roof for a Victorian-style house, but there is some great spindle work wrapping that front porch. The Matt L. Flynn House, built in 1887 at 1222 Douglas Street. I used a couple pictures, a slightly older picture, and then this color slide from the 1950s. You can see there's obviously a 3-story tower, and at the top of the eave line, you can see there is half timbering, the diamond-shaped patterns nearing in the midsection of the tower. You can see that on both of these sections. The H.C. Mall House, which is actually the little bitty building you see on the far left, was built in 1887 at 1415 Grandview. Edwin Donaldson bought the house and in 1890 put a large addition on the front. You can see the original cost of construction was $2,000. The addition of the front facade was $3,000. This house features both a tower there on the far left and a turret toward the center of the photograph where the turret sticks out of the corner of the house. This house also, that turret features an elaborate S-shaped roof, and the element I want to point out here is on the right, this incised gable decoration. The Ernest R. Smith House, built in 1887 at 1401 Pierce Street. This house was designed by Charles Porter Brown and cost $5,000 to build. Sioux City Attorney C.R. Marks built this house in 1887 at 1205 Douglas Street. This was designed by George Baldwin and built at a cost of just over $10,000. The Fred Beck House. This house is still standing. It was built in 1887, located at 1311 Jackson Street. This was designed by J.W. Martin, built by Fred Beck, who is a contractor, all at the cost of $11,500. The Matt L. Sloan House. This is an image from Google Maps, and I did use Google Maps in a couple of cases, and it's usually cited right down there in the corner that I've taken these images from there. This house was built in 1888, located at 1423 Douglas Street. This house was designed by J.W. Martin, and the cost of construction was $8,000. Here's a case where we have a couple of interiors. Now, granted, these interiors were taken in the 1930s or 1940s, but they show an interior of a house like this. This appears to be a front parlor or a music room. And there's also an image of the dining room. The fixtures, like the lighting fixtures, may have been altered by the time this photo was taken 50 years after the house was built. But the door and casework and transom window, that's the window above the door, those would likely be fairly original to this structure. The Eugene Westervelt House, built in 1889 at 511 13th Street, cost of construction was $4,000. The M.W. Starks House, built in 1889, is still standing at 843 17th Street. The cost of construction of this house was $5,000. This one is kind of neat because the tower isn't really projecting out from the building, but it's more just part of that wrapped corner and then a small tower emerging from the roof line. This is the William Johnson House. He was a tailor, a clothing maker. He built this house in 1889 at 1300 Jennings Street. This shows the house, this image is from the 1970s, but this house is still standing. And what I wanted to point out in this image is on the top of the tower, again we see an elaborate S-shaped roof with a tall finial, about a 5-foot tall finial. And we see again a Palladian window on the gable end on the left, that arched window flanked by two smaller square windows. We already saw Horace Mall's name before. Well, he built a new house in 1889 at 1423 Grandview Boulevard. The cost of construction of this house was $6,000. Now, what I wanted to point out as another element of design here is a cutaway bay. So a cutaway bay, you can see here on the right, there's a bay window, but the gable end roof protrudes out above that bay, so the front facade of the bay is lined up with the front gable end, and we can also see bay window corner brackets. So again, on either side of the bay window, you can see the brackets which help that cantilevered cutaway reconnect to the house. So we'll see that. We've probably already seen that before, we just haven't been pointed out. This double house, we don't know who built it, but I know it was built in 1889 at 1625 to 27 Douglas Street. That is still standing. The Thomas Park Gearhouse in Rose Hill was built in 1889 on Grandview Boulevard. It was one of the larger buildings built during this era. The cost of construction was $15,000. Another characteristic of Queen Anne Victorian style architecture are recessed porches or balconies on second and third or even fourth floors. You can see here in this little inset, there's a balcony that is located on the far left side of the other image. The Albert C. Kellogg House was built in 1890, located at 1514 Nebraska Street. It was built at a cost of $3,500. And this image I want to point out, roof cresting. So along the ridges of the gables, along the roofline ridges, you can see this cresting. It's sometimes implemented in tin or copper, but just another decoration. The Walter Webb House was built in 1890 at 1220 Walnut Street, which is today 18th Street. This is just east of Court Street. The cost of construction of this house was $7,500. The Mrs. Appv House, built in 1890, was located at 1120 Douglas Street. Cost of construction was $8,500. W.E. Higman, who was a major North Side developer, built this double house in 1890 at 414 to 416 14th Street. This is today where a Come and Go gas station is located, the one at 14th and Pierce. Frank L. Clark built two houses in 1890, one at 1403 Summit and another at 1113 14th Street. We can see in this image the one at 1403 Summit. These were designed by J.S. Reese, built by J.E. Nason. The two houses together, the cost of construction was $9,000. Charles Franklin Hoyt built this row house in 1890 between 1612 and 1618 Pierce Street. This was a photo from our publicity. This is the Richard C.A. Flourny house, built in 1890 at 1427 Douglas Street. The cost of construction was $17,000. Now this house is still standing and has been featured in some in various newspaper and magazine articles. And we have some great photographs of the interior. It's nice to see things in color, isn't it? So this is the front entryway and the main stairwell of the house. This is the dining room and looking into, this is an image of the dining room looking into one of the front parlors. You can see the great casement work has remained. These photos were taken in the 1990s, so the house is already over 90 years old. You can see here on the right, this is a small fireplace that's just on a small balcony up from just a couple stairs up from the main entrance. And another characteristic of Victorian-style houses are decorative chimneys. You can see the corbelled brickwork, the stepped-out brickwork that is on this chimney, and it's made a great home for a couple of pigeons. The Horace Marvin House was built in 1890 at 1705 Grandview Boulevard. The construction of this massive house was $20,000. At the end of its life, this house was home to a nursing home. It is no longer standing. The Ransom J. Chase House, which was just torn down a couple of years ago, was built in 1890 at 1529 Grandview Boulevard. The construction of this massive house was $34,500. That's going to be just about the most expensive house we see in this talk. So, I wanted to make a little digression. We've seen, you're familiar now with what Queen Anne Victorian style architecture is. But this is one of the earliest instances where we see mail order houses. George F. Barber, a Knoxville, Tennessee-based architect, was drawing plans and selling materials lists with all the materials you would need, all the ornamentation you would need. You could buy this, house design number 24, and have it built for between $1,800 and $2,000. This was his second book of house designs, published in 1891. To the best of my knowledge, I've not been able to find any Barber houses that were actually built in Sioux City. I looked through about every design in these books and couldn't find anything matching in Sioux City. Not only could you buy a whole house, but you could buy individual house parts. Like you could buy yourself a front porch. Or you could buy yourself gable end decorations. Or buy yourself a pre-built stairwell. This is, again, the era of mass production, and the more you can do in a factory, the cheaper it makes, the less expensive it makes the products in the end to install and build. Sioux City firms were not immune from this. Sioux City business, Curtis Sash and Door Works, also manufactured architectural elements to be installed in houses, pre-made elements. You can see there on the left, your gable end decorations. In the center, you can have your spindles and balusters pre-made, even your stairwells pre-made. And not only stairwells, but also columns and colonnades and passageways throughout your house. You could also mail order your stained glass windows or your Queen Anne style window sashes. The William Hunt House, still standing, was built in 1891 and is at 1519 Nebraska Street. The cost of construction of this house was $4,800. Charles DeMunn House in Rose Hill, 1417 Grandview Boulevard, was built in 1891 for $5,300. The Charles Brune House. Charles Brune was an early Sioux City grocer, built this new house in 1891 at 1431 Grandview Boulevard. The house was designed by Charles Porter Brown and built at a cost of construction is $12,000. This house burned down, I believe, in the 1950s. The Frank B. Hutchins House. We see a historic image and a more modern image. The structure was built in 1891 at 1115 Douglas Street. It is still standing. The Harold J. Hutton House, built in 1892 at 1611 Jackson Street, was built at a cost of $2,800. This, again, is another shingle substyle house. The structure is entirely covered with shingles. Actually, I've never introduced this style. I was thinking stick in my mind. This is a shingle style. So instead of having clapboards and shingles, or just clapboards, this is entirely covered with shingles. Roof, gable ends, first floor, second floor, every element is covered with shingles. The David A. Mcgee house, built in 1892, was once located at 309 13th Street. That house was moved back in the 1990s to Plum Creek Road by Gene Callaghan and Ike Sammons. It is still standing today. I didn't say, not Broken Kettle Road, Plum Creek Road. My error. That's rare. The Rudolph Seltzer House is a massive masonry structure. This was at 905 Douglas Street, built in 1893. I couldn't find a definitive cost of construction, but I would gather based on what we've seen throughout this talk and what other masonry structures cost, we're probably looking at somewhere between $20,000 and $30,000. The LZ Birkham House, commonly known as the English Mansion, was built in 1894 at 1525 Grandview Boulevard. This house is still standing, and this house is an example of a variation of Queen Anne. It's the free classic variant, which we've seen the spindle work, the fine columns and spindle work. The free classics very often feature larger columns and capped with Corinthian capitals. So like the European Corinthians, the Greek Corinthian capitals, that's what we see on some of these houses. A couple of interiors. This house, again, is still standing. So some of these photos were taken back in the 1990s of a period restoration home. That is the front parlor. And here is your stairwell. There's Sioux City historian Gretchen Schalge giving a tour probably of the Rose Hill neighborhood. The William Farnsworth House. You might not think of this as a Queen Anne style house, but it is. All the ornamentation is there. This is built fairly late in the Queen Anne style period. This is built in 1898 at 1505 Jackson Street. This house is still standing. But this is just a really neat house because you have that great gable out front. But I also love this barn-shaped roof. That's called a gambrel. And it's just a really neat variation of Queen Anne style architecture. You'll see a few examples of this style throughout the nation. And what I wanted to focus on here was a cantilever. So I have a smaller footprint on the first floor and then a larger second floor. You can see that in the center of the image where there's that curved bracket holding up the second floor, because the second floor probably extends 3 or 4 feet beyond the first floor of this house. We're moving up. We're going to the north side and hit a couple houses in Leeds. The north side was really the hotbed of Victorian and Queen Anne Victorian style architecture, largely because of a few developers. I've already talked a little bit, I mentioned W.E. Higman as a major developer of the north side. Well, this was his personal house, which he had built in 1884 at 1909 Jackson Street. The cost of this structure was $12,500. I had thought years ago that this house was long gone. But during the demolition of the former Hunt Elementary School and the houses in that neighborhood, as asbestos siding was being taken down, I saw that there was a Victorian-style house, and indeed, this house was still standing up until about 2 or 3 years ago. A much smaller example, this is much more of a folk Victorian, largely because of its size, and that's the big difference between a Queen Anne and a folk Victorian is largely to do with size and the amount of decoration. This is the George E. Kellogg house, built in 1888 and still standing at 3131 Jones Street. The Zeno Brown House. This was just south of the former home of the Sioux City Public Museum, the Pierce Mansion. This was at 2821 Jackson Street, built in 1888. The cost of construction of this house was $10,090. Zeno Brown was the son-in-law of D.T. Hedges, and we're going to talk a lot about D.T. Hedges in just a little bit. This is the William McKercher House, built in 1889 at 2309 Douglas Street. Cost of construction of this house, relatively modest, $2,500. And of course, you can see on either side of this house, there are other Victorian-style houses. The William Phoenix House was built in 1889. Again, this is just about a block away from the Pierce Mansion at 710 29th Street. It's a smaller example, a $3,000 example of a Queen Anne Victorian-style house. William Phoenix had this house built. He was actually the the engineer for the Sioux City Cable Railway Company, which had the public transit line that went up and down Jackson Street to connect downtown with the far north side. The T.W. Hood House was built in 1889 and is still standing at 2911 Nebraska Street. You can see the Cutaway Bays on the left end. Of course, we have a square tower. And you can see in this image the scalloped pattern shingles on the third floor of this house. James V. Maloney House was built in 1889 and is still standing at 2810 Nebraska Street. The cost of construction on this house was $3,500. Just around the corner from that is the G.E. Forsterling House, built in 1889 at 3014 Nebraska Street. This house was built by contractor Robert F. Baker for the cost of $3,800. Some of you might be familiar with this house because you would never want to mow its front lawn. It's like a mountain. E.W. Loft, Sioux City architect, built his own personal residence in 1889 at 2101 Jackson Street. The cost of construction of this home was $4,000. The Walter S. Belden House, built in 1889 at 2826 Nebraska Street. It cost $4,200. This house is still standing, but it looks significantly different. The house being built in 1889 was modernized in 1910. So the house is still standing, but looks quite a bit different. We're moving up to Leeds. This is the C.M. Giddings House, built in 1889 at 4305 45th Street. The cost of construction of this house was $4,500. And one more Leeds house. This is a smaller folk Victorian at 4019 Madison Street, built around 1890. What I wanted to focus on here, we have a great house that is entirely covered with shingles, but I wanted to look at the pattern shingles. This little zoom-in portion here on the right, you can see a wavy shingle, a diamond-shaped shingle, and then a scallop-shaped shingle. Again, Victorians use any device to break up surfaces. John Pierce, the real estate magnate, built this house as a wedding gift for one of his daughters. She never lived there. This house was built in 1889 at 2804 Jennings Street. It served as the first home of St. Joseph Hospital. This house is still standing. Charles Kellogg built 4 houses in the 1700 block of Pierce Street between 1889 and 1990. The construction of the 4 houses was $14,500. D.T. Hedges built probably the most spectacular Queen Anne Victorian-style house in Sioux City in 1889. This house was once upon a time located at 2803 Jackson Street. The house was designed by E.W. Loft, built by contractor James P. Wall, and the cost of construction was a whopping $29,000. But we have the spindle work, we have the tower, we have the variations in texture, we have shingles, we have clapboards, we have everything. Want to take a look, just because this is probably one of the best examples, of the other facade of this house, looking at the other side. We had a cantilevered entryway, we have a secondary tower, spindle work on the porch, we've got a balcony on the 3rd floor, we've got a balcony on the 4th floor, and it doesn't just stop with the exterior, because we move inside, and we can see his entryway. We've got a fake fireplace underneath his stairwell, we have patterned carpet, and in this image alone, I see 2 patterns of wallpaper. Moving into his parlor, we have 4 patterns of wallpaper, the patterned carpet, and who does not want a stuffed owl in their living room? Here is his dining room. Again, we have wallpaper on the ceiling, on the walls, probably 4 or 5 different patterns of wallpaper, a patterned tablecloth, and patterned not just rug, because at this state it is a rug, but it's the full size of the floor. There isn't a bit of wood floor showing underneath that. D.T. Hedges. I put together a secondary list while putting this talk together of the houses in this Victorian era that he financed on their construction up and down Jackson Street. And there are many. I mean, I came up with more than 50 houses. But here are a couple. a few that are still standing. So D.T. Hedges had these houses built between 1888 and 1890, including 3221 Jackson Street, 2214 Jackson Street, 602 28th Street, all in 1888 or 1890 between $2,700 and $5,000. D.T. Hedges also built this house at 2122 Jackson Street. This house was featured in a newspaper article about 20 years ago, and there was a great picture of one of its stained glass windows, so I decided to include that for your enjoyment. The C. Bevan Oldfield House, built in 1890 at 2303 Douglas Street. Take a look at this house, because here it is again, and a mirror image house at 2110 Jackson Street. Possibly both of these houses were built by D.T. Hedges for $3,500 in 1890, and C. Bevan Oldfield was just the first name that showed up in the house that's depicted in black and white. Another couple of identical Queen Anne Victorian-style houses, one at 3526 and one at 3635 Jackson Street, both built in 1890 for a cost of $3,500. Well, they're not identical. They were mirror images of one another. Oops. Then this house, the D.T. Hedges houses, 3601 Jackson Street and 2222 Jackson Street, both built in 1890. The cost of construction of these houses was $4,000, and one house, 2222 Jackson Street, was later occupied by Andrew Ellison. The Oscar Goodrich House was built in 1890 at 2814 Jennings Street. The Viola F. Lowry House, built in 1890 at 3203 Jackson Street, at the cost of $5,000. This is another shingle-style house. The house is completely clad in shingles. This structure is also still standing. The Linus E. Skinner House was located at 28th and Nebraska Street and built in 1890, designed by J.W. Martin at the cost of $7,000. The Robert F. Baker House, built in 1890 at 3203 Jackson Street. Baker himself was a contractor, and this was his personal reward. The house was built for $8,000. This house is also still standing, though it looks absolutely nothing like this today. This house is still standing, the Charles W. Hornick House, built in 1890 at 2727 Jackson Street, built by W.V. Hedges, who is the son of D.T. Hedges. This house cost $10,000 to build. This is the William Gordon House, built in 1890 at 2721 Jackson Street. We also see the last couple houses we talked about. On the right-hand side is the Charles W. Hornick House, and in the background is the Linus Skinner House. Some interiors. This house is not nearly as ostentatious or elaborate as D.T. Hedges' house was, but we still have a patterned rug, curtains for doors. This would have been a typical wealthy person's parlor. And here is a small sub-parlor. And here is William Gordon's dining room. Many of these photos from the 1890s are from the Charles N. Taylor photograph collection. We also have a talk on his photography. The S.H. Hess House, we don't have an exterior, but we do have an interior. This house was built in 1890 at 603 28th Street. That's the corner of 28th and Nebraska. This is at the cost of construction was a little over $13,000. And here we can see Hess's parlor. And here is Hess's entryway and stairwell. The Chris Mahler House was built in 1891, located at 2933 Jackson Street. The cost of construction was $6,200. This house is also still standing. T.S. Martin, the department store magnate, had this house built in 1891 at 2801 Nebraska Street for the cost of $9,750. What I find fascinating about this, the house was built in 1891, but features a characteristic that wasn't common until later, And if you look at the front gable that's kind of there on the left side of the photograph, it has a multi-pitched roof. You don't really see that until after the start of the 20th century, until around 1901 or 1905, when Queen Anne Victorian style architecture is kind of waning away. This is the Willard C. Shull House, built in 1891 at 2822 Jackson Street. This house, which is the Linda Sioux Manor today, was built at a cost of $10,000. Just up Jackson Street is the George Smith House, built in 1892. This at 3629 Jackson Street. It's the house on the left. Charles Porter Brown, the architect, showed us that you could build a masonry, concrete, and rock house in the Victorian style with that neat pagoda roof tower. This house was built for the cost of $7,000 and is still standing at 2002 Jackson Street. The Giles W. Brown House at 24th in Nebraska was built in 1892, and it cost $8,000. The James F. Toy House, which is still standing, was built in 1892 at 1902 Jackson Street. The cost of construction was $15,000. This photograph was taken back when the house was still pink and blue. And this has been featured in several newspaper articles as well. So you can see there on the left is the fireplace. There's at the time the owner was Ray Hoffman. You can see him standing in front of a large stained glass window in the stairwell. And then there is his Victorian-styled parlor, stained glass window, elaborate fireplace, nice casework, and large area rug. We get into Richardsonian Romanesque architecture now. This is the William Element House, built in 1892 at 1823 Jackson Street. This is Richardsonian Romanesque architecture, which is all masonry, features rough surfaced but square cut stones. You'll see rounded arches, parapeted gables, squat columns, steep pitched roofs, and you'll often see turrets and towers. The John Pierce House is a combination of Richardsonian Romanesque and Queen Anne style architecture. This building is still standing at 2901 Jackson Street, designed by Charles Porter Brown, built by contractor Håkan Halseth at a cost of $40,000. That is the most expensive house we'll see in this presentation. Here is what the interior looked like historically. You can see there's no beamed ceiling like there is today. This is the main entrance. And here is the front parlor, which has now been turned into a single room, this room and the room behind it. Across the street from that is the Charles Milius House, built in 1894 at 2902 Jackson Street. This structure was designed by William McLaughlin, and the cost of construction was $12,000. The key feature of this house that I want to point out is, again, that half timbering, which you can see in the two large gable roofs. There are 7 houses in the 3200 block of Jones Street that were once identical. There is a historic photo of 3246 Jones Street and 3 other houses in that block that have been modified just a little bit, but there's enough there that you can tell they were all the same at one time. We're going to move to the west side and Riverside. Early on, this house was built by Fred T. Evans Jr., built in 1886 at 521 Odo Street at a cost of $3,100. Check it out. This house actually is still standing, although it looks absolutely nothing like this today. Frederick M. Sterling designed many of the houses you're about to see on the west side. He was a contractor and architect, or maybe not officially an architect, but he was a designer. This is his personal dwelling he built in 1887 at 1512 West 16th. This house is still standing. A more modest home, this is the Olaus Hansen House, built in 1888 at 511 West 4th Street. Cost of construction, $1,500. 117 and 119 Perry Street are identical, or they were. One house is the historic image, that house is gone, but its twin is still standing. They were built in 1888. William Remsen Smith, a lot like D.T. Hedges on the north side, William Smith built many houses, speculative houses, on the west side, including this house at 1603 Ross Street in 1888. This structure was designed by Frederick Miller Sterling. W.J. Radcliffe built 4 houses between 1888 and 1891. They were all identical between 517 and 523 Market Street. They're small, but you can still see the Victorian details. James Wall, we've seen his name pop up once or twice. He was a contractor, and he built this masonry house with a great tower in 1888 at 411 Market Street. The cost of construction of this house was $11,000. This house was raised when a new Webster Elementary School was built in 1938. A Richardsonian Romanesque house on the west side. This is the John C. French House, built in 1888 at 1723 Rebecca Street. Built by contractor George Hawson, and the cost of construction actually relatively modest, $17,000 for a big stone house like this. W.W. Byam was a major West Side promoter, and he built his house on the far west side in 1889 at 1747 California Avenue. This house features 2 towers. It is gone, but the carriage house you see at the far left is still standing and is its own house today. The Sidney Moser House was built in 1889 at 2215 Kellogg Street at a whopping price tag of $17,000. This is when it was pink. I don't remember pink. It's been white my whole life. Ida Allen built a couple of houses at 605 and 607 Bluff Street in 1890. You can see the scallop shingles on the roof line, the diagonal slatted clapboards still on that gable end, and the spindle work in the front on the first floor porch. William Remsen Smith houses, 1890, nearly identical, 1903 and 1905 Rebecca Street. These houses were designed by that architect I mentioned before, F.M. Sterling. Each house cost $4,000. William Remsen Smith built more speculative houses, probably both designed by F.M. Sterling, although one is attributed to him and one is not. These houses at 1813 Isabella and the other at 1823 Rebecca. The house on the left has a full front porch. The house on the right would have had a full front porch, but part of it was removed at some point in time. William Kiefer House was built in 1890 at 1509 Rebecca Street. It was designed by Fred Sterling, cost $4,500 to build. This house just burned in a fire within the last couple of years. The Ogilvy C. Treadway House, built in 1890 at 1001 West 6th Street. You can see the newspaper clipping image on the left showing the house back in the 1930s and all what the house looks like today, because this house is still standing. It cost $6,200 and some odd cents to build. The Milton Perry Smith House, near the former Smith Elementary School, built in 1890 at 1705 Rebecca. Milton Smith was the son of William Smith. This house is neat. I wanted to focus on this. Designed by F.M. Sterling. Cost of construction was $6,500. But this is a rare instance where we get to see actual architectural drawings, local architectural drawings of a house from this era. So here you can see the south facade of this house. And here is just the architectural drawing of the floor plan. You can see the image on the left is the first floor with your entryway, your parlor, library and dining room, kitchen in the back, and then your 4 bedrooms on the second floor, and your bathroom and water closet in the back corner. James Bogue, who was a meatpacking magnate, built this house in 1890 at 2803 Isabella Street at the cost of $10,000. This house is still standing. James F. Peavy built this house in 1890 at 2805 Rebecca Street for $15,000. This house is still standing, but this is another instance where we get some great Charles N. Taylor photos of the interior. Here is his entryway, and I know because Haley is working on a talk on the power production in Sioux City, we're taking a look at gas lighting versus electric lighting. This house only has electric lighting in 1890. So this is the front entryway, your front parlor with curtains for doors and area rugs and only 2 types of wallpaper. The dining room with massive fireplace and mantel. And let's just carry it upstairs into the bedrooms. Full area rug patterned and 2 different patterns of wallpaper on the wall. This house, built circa 1890 at 2223 South Fawcett, this house is still standing. J.C.C. Hoskins' house was built in 1891 at 1523 Rebecca Street. This design was designed by F.M. Sterling and built for $12,000. This is one of the houses that was raised for the construction of a new Liberty Elementary School. And of course, the big house on the west side is the William Remsen Smith House itself, finished in 1891 at 1615 Rebecca Street, designed by F.M. Sterling, built by contractor George Hawson, for approximately $30,000. I couldn't nail down an actual figure, but based on other architecture of the time, I'm going to guess that's about where we are. This image is, of course, taken in the early 20th century after this house building had been modified into a school building. The Wilbur F. Tuttle House is still standing, built in 1893 and located at 1501 West 15th Street. And our lone Queen Anne Victorian style house in Riverside, 5219 Military Road, built around 1894. And last but not least, we hit Morningside. Now I feel like I've slighted Morningsiders just a little bit, but the problem with identifying and researching Morningside houses, they don't have addresses. They don't get addresses until into the 20th century. And so many of the original builders of these houses, it says so-and-so is building a house at blank station along the elevated railroad. So I have no way of knowing where some of these houses are, knowing full well there are some good Victorian houses in Morningside, but not being able to pinpoint much detail about them. However, some of them we can. James A. Jackson, pioneer Sioux City merchant and namesake of Jackson Street, built his personal residence in central Morningside in 1888 at 4002 Morningside Avenue. The cost of construction of this house and equally elaborate barn was $15,000. The John T. Chaney House, built in 1889 at the corner of Morningside Avenue and Nicolette Street, was designed by George Baldwin. It too cost $15,000. Arthur Samuel Garrettson, our big booster of the 1880s and 1890s, built his quartzite home in 1889 at the corner of South St. Alban and Morningside Avenue. This is today the parking lot in front of the Morningside Branch Library. A.S. Wilson built this stick frame house in 1890 at 2011 South St. Alban. It was designed by J.S. Reese, built by J.E. Nason. The cost of construction was $5,000. John M. Poorbaugh, who owned quartzite mines up in Minnesota and South Dakota, built his personal residence here. It's out of stone. It's a Richardsonian Romanesque style building, designed by Charles Porter Brown, built by contractor John Poorbaugh, at a cost of $17,000. This house is still standing. We have one image of the interior. It's damaged. I wish we could see a little bit more because where the glass plate negative broke off in that upper right corner, I bet there's a pretty cool stained glass window there, but we'll never know. This shows the banister and newel post in the entryway of the Poorbaugh house. The Allen Crossan House was built in 1891 in South Morningside. It was built for a cost of $5,000. I say South Morningside because there's no accurate way to describe its location. It's near where the Southern Hills Mall is today. It was a farm out in the middle of nowhere when it was built in 1891. The Robert C. Glass House, built in 1891 at 3615 Transit Avenue for $6,000. This house is still standing. It doesn't look like this anymore, though. Adam V. Larimer House, built in 1891 at 2105 South St. Aubin, cost of $10,500. This is a cross between Richardsonian Romanesque and Queen Anne style architecture, and it's kind of a little bit of commercial architecture looking as well. This is one of the great ones. John T. Chaney, we already saw his house, but a few blocks away from that, in 1891, he built 4 houses, 3 identical and 1 slightly different. It was what was called the John T. Chaney Quadrangle, all 4 houses built for $15,000. You can see their addresses there, 2053 and 2061 South Henry Street, and 2054 and 2058 South Clinton. Again, some really neat Victorian-style architecture in Morningside, but we don't know who and when they were built. So this is 2040 South St. Aubin, built around 1890. That house is still standing. 2115 South St. Aubin, built around 1890. 2030 South St. Aubin, built around 1890. This house is still standing. 3007 J Avenue, we shot up to Cecilia Park now. This house was built around 1890. You can see the house there on the far left, and you can, of course, see the tower and the scallop shingles along its second floor and the various Victorian-style outbuildings. 3212 4th Avenue Place, again, built around 1890. I just don't know. It's hard to research these houses because there aren't specific addresses, and sometimes we don't even know the people who built them. And if I knew a builder, I might not have a picture of the house. I might have a picture of the house and not know the builder. It's tough. This image was recently identified by my coworker Matt. This is 3734 5th Avenue, built sometime around 1890. This is a great one. Nice wavy shingles, a really interesting round tower, great S-shaped roof on that, and a massive finial there at the top of this 3-story tower. This is 3804 4th Avenue. The Victorian details in some ways are kind of obscured, and in other ways you can imagine what would happen if there wasn't a solid wall around that first floor porch, and if there wasn't the fire escapes. You can see the Victorian overall design of this house. A couple more modest houses. There are several houses along the 4500 block of 3rd Avenue in Morningside, all built around 1890. They're all relatively similar, about three or 4 bedroom houses, all built around the same time. And this is the final slide, and it's one that has the greatest story because this has confounded me for months as I've been putting this talk together. I think this is the Edmund Jenkinson house at 1304 Morningside Avenue, built in 1891, but I'm not sure. This image appeared in a 1903 Morningside College yearbook with just the title, Scenes of Morningside. So I know the house was in Morningside. My problem is, this is a massive house. It's brick and it's stone, and the only house I could find that matched this in any kind of building permit records was the Edmund Jenkinson house. I might be wrong. I'm looking for your help. If anybody knows this house, let me know. It's clearly not around anymore. So saying that, help me with my great mystery. But I want to thank you all for coming today and learning a little bit about Victorian, largely Queen Anne Victorian style architecture. Thank you so much again, and